Okay, let's talk discrimination. Here's the thing about discrimination. It's not a bad word. Contrary to what you're told today, discrimination is actually necessary. If you don't discriminate, you won't know anything at all. You actually discriminate all the time. In fact, I was reading on this just last week. I didn't realize I was going to be reading on this, but the chapter got weird. Biologically, it's your ability for your cells to distinguish between what is the cell and what isn't the cell. What makes it discriminate between itself and not itself that actually builds your body's proteins, and from your proteins build your organs, and from your organs build your entire organ systems that help you actually live. So if your cells don't biologically discriminate, you don't live. Mentally, if you can't distinguish one thing from another, nothing is clear. Everything is chaos. You don't have order. You have no life. And what we will see in Genesis 1 in particular is God dividing day from night, land from sea, all of these things. He makes distinctions, or he discriminates one thing from another. Adam will carry on that process when he names the animals. This is an elephant. I know it's an elephant and not a giraffe. And he gives the labels to those things. That's his job. He follows God's leading in Genesis 2, what God does in Genesis 1. A more accepted term than discrimination in religious circles is discernment. And you've probably heard that more in churches than the word discrimination. But in the end, it's the exact same thing. There's no functional difference between discrimination and discernment. It's a matter of semantics. And the truth is, words don't actually have meanings. Meanings have words. They take on words. When you need to talk about something negatively versus positively, but the same thing, you typically pick a word for the negative, you pick a word for the positive, and that's how people will know whether you're speaking about the good thing or the bad thing. Well, as we will look at shortly, discrimination wasn't originally used in the English language as a bad thing. It evolved to take on bad things, and we tend to use the term discernment to mean the good kind of understanding. But it's the good kind of discrimination. Now, in order to practice discrimination, I first need to overwhelm you. So let me overwhelm you to teach you the necessity of discrimination. You know, that thing you're already doing. So let's look at some Old Testament stats. The Hebrew Old Testament has 39 books consisting of 929 chapters, 23,145 verses, and the longest chapter in the Bible is Psalm 119, totaling 176 verses. It's 2/3 of your entire Bible, your Old Testament. Now, chapters and verses obviously were added much later than they're written, but they're a helpful discrimination tool. It helps you discriminate chapter to chapter. Where does one story end and another begin? They're pretty good. So 929 chapters, 23,145 verses. Pretty long. The Greek New Testament, consisting of 27 books, has 260 chapters, 7,957 verses. So about 1/3 of the overall Protestant Bible is the New Testament. Out of the 66 books, Jeremiah is the single largest book in the Bible because Psalms is a collection of songs and poetry and it subdivides into 5 separate books of worship. They were collected, edited, and compiled into the order they were for Jewish worship post-exile. And so really the Psalms is 5 books, not 1. Jeremiah, therefore, is the longest book. However, Luke, in his 2 volumes, Luke writes word for word more than any other biblical author. So when somebody asks you who writes the most in the Bible, the answer is Luke. Somebody says who wrote the longest book in the Bible, the answer is Jeremiah. So, total Bible stats, 66 books, 63, 1,189 chapters, 31,102 verses, which makes Psalm 103, verses 1 and 2, as the middle point in the Bible. If you're counting verse by verse and you're using the Protestant book order, Psalm 103 verse 1 is the 15,551st verse. Psalm 103 verse 2 is the 15,552nd verse. So if you started in Genesis and you were reading to Revelation, when you get to Psalm 103, 1 and 2, you've hit your halfway point. This is somewhat arbitrary in that the Hebrew Bible versus our English Bibles number slightly differently, verse to verse. The superscriptions above Psalms, a Psalm of David, a Psalm of Asaph, a Psalm of Ascent, the Song of Moses in Psalm 90, those we don't count as verses, so they're excluded from this. However, in the Hebrew Bible, those will all be verse 1, which means most of the Psalms that have a superscription at the beginning are actually one verse longer. So it does depend on how you count. However, I'm using the Bible that you're most likely to be using, other than some of the ones I showed you last week, to count this. So Psalm 103 is about middle point in the Bible. So with 66 books spanning 1,189 chapters or 31,102 verses, where does one start? You could start at the beginning and you could go to the end. You could skip around. You could reorder the books of the Bible the way that we looked at last week. The Tanakh does not have the prophets at the end of the Old Testament. They have it in the middle of the Old Testament. It's all different categories and different ways of actually practicing discrimination. The prophets are different than the writings. The writings are different than the law. The law, of course, is different than the prophets. So you start categorizing things to help you understand and discern them. That's called discrimination, in the good sense of the word. Now, we're going to do about a 90-second exercise. I'm not going to keep you that long. I'm already too hungry for that. About a 90-second exercise of this video here. If you've seen this before, because this is 25 years old, more than that, please don't react. Just do what the video says and see if you can beat the video. But no. This is a video on selective attention. So as we watch this, I want you to just follow the on-screen instructions. Let me turn the volume up so you can hear the instructions, but they're going to be written up there, so it's not like you need to hear. So follow these on-screen instructions and just do what they tell you and see if you can get the right number.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla? This video is from research.
Okay, so who saw the gorilla? Have y'all seen this one before? It's pretty old, but it's a good... I mean, I counted 17 earlier today. So, but I remember the first time that I saw this years ago, and I think I might have counted 12 times, and I had no idea there was a gorilla there. And most people don't the first time that they see it, because when you don't know it and you're really trying to count the times the white shirts pass, you don't notice anything. And this is exactly how selective attention works. Our brains filter out information it doesn't need or thinks it doesn't need. So you can only experience so much information at once. So you see what you choose to see a lot of the times, or you see what you need to see. and your brain just naturally filters out the rest. The mom here isn't going to be paying attention to the guy with the soccer ball. The guy with the dog isn't going to be paying attention to the girl on her cell phone, and yada, yada, yada. It's just you're in the mode of saying, I got to take care of this baby, so everything else that is not the baby goes away. Everything available to see and experience is safely ignored, and the purpose of it is so that you can survive. Right now, there are let me keep going. I'll get to that. Nobody sees everything, and if you've seen this movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once, it's a good example of it. It won the Oscar for Best Picture 2 or 3, 4 years ago. I don't know. It was a good movie. I didn't know if it was Oscar worthy, but it was a good movie. But the antagonist in this multiverse universe where everything is happening in every universe, one of Michelle Yeoh's characters in one universe experiments on this person and gives them the ability to see and experience all universes at once, which is for the character, she's just living in absolute hell. And so her punishment is she's going to make Michelle Yeoh's character in every universe basically either kill her or make her experience everything everywhere all at once. And you can't do that. Right now, there are an infinite number of variables right here in this room. But our minds group those variables together, form categories for it, and discriminates one thing from another categorically just so that you can survive. You don't pay attention to how many of these white bricks are actually over here in this wall, because they're all grouped together, they form one big wall, and as long as they function as a wall, you don't care. And that's exactly right. Your car is not a collection of 4 wheels, a frame, an engine, an alternator, a belt, a steering wheel, a gas pedal. It is none of those things. As long as it works, it's a car. And your mind thinks of it like that. When something breaks, then you have to diagnose and figure out what it is by suddenly taking it all apart, at least mentally, and a lot of the times with a car, physically, until you can figure out what the problem is. But if there's no problem, your brain groups together the fact that you're sitting on a pew, and as long as that pew holds you up, you don't concern yourself with any other details about it. As long as it's comfortable, you're good. As long as you're not too hot, you don't think about the air kicking on. You get too hot, you get uncomfortable, there's a problem. And your mind jolts into that problem, and you want to solve the problem. But when the problem's solved, you go right back to forgetting about it. And that's selective attention or discrimination. That's how your brain actually works. You want to be at peace with yourself, God, the world around you, and other people so that there's no problems for you to solve and figure out. Well, we don't live in that world. There's always problems to solve and figure out. And if you can practice good discrimination, you can better acknowledge the problems as they come along and help to work them out as you go. So, my argument is that discrimination is a necessary evil. Now, let's just read this, because I just pulled this in the next slide off of Wikipedia. So, discrimination is the process of making unfair or prejudicial distinctions between people based on groups, classes, and other categories to which they belong or are perceived to belong, such as race, gender, age, class, religion, or sexual orientation, and it keeps going from there. Discrimination typically leads to groups being unfairly treated on the basis of perceived statuses based on ethnic, racial, gender, So this is the negative idea of discrimination, and this is what most of the time people are talking about when they talk about discrimination. However, there are good and bad ways to discriminate. And as I've already made for my point, if you don't discriminate, you don't know anything. If you can't discriminate, you can't learn. To understand something, you must discriminate it from another thing. Now, let's read, down here. So when you ask yourself what is a woman, you have to distinguish between what is a man. And this is like the first thing Adam does when he sees the woman. He's like, oh, she needs a different name. If I'm a man, she's not. They're naked, he can tell. And so he gives her a name befitting her character. And that point of the story is to explain why a woman is not a man. Now, originally, as I've said already, the term discriminate in the English language didn't actually apply to in a negative sense, at least not solely. Let's just read what I've highlighted here. Before this sense of the word became almost universal, it was a synonym for discernment, tact and culture, as in taste and discrimination, generally a laudable trait, attribute, to discriminate against, being commonly disparaged. So later on, it's going to take on a purely negative sense, as we need a word that describes more and more the negative forms of discrimination. And then we tend to lean towards words like discernment to talk about positive ways of discrimination. But it's the same thing. You'd never be able to do anything ever if you could not discriminate. You'd never be able to form relationships and groups, societies, cultures, languages, if you could not discriminate one thing from another. But besides that, look, if you didn't discriminate, you have no reward system. Mentally, your brain rewards you when you move up in a value structure, which is why we naturally create value structures. If you can't move up the value structure, you can't have a chemical reward in your brain, in which case, if everything is all equal all the time and nothing is hierarchical, you will be depressed all the time because you have no reward systems in your mental brain. You have no relational reward system. If nobody in your life is relationally different from you, you can't actually form intimacy with anybody else. Let's talk about a few value structures here. This is a common ancient value structure in three broad strokes here. Self-control, courage, wisdom, justice, very largely Greek structures. You'll find these as common cultural things in New Testament times in particular. Power and prosperity would be just underneath that. But, down at the bottom of the totem pole, serving others, meeting the needs of the helpless and the weak, that was not a very high value trait. Just didn't move you up in honor-shame cultures. Today's modern value restructuring looks like this. You've got DEI and victimhood at the top. Whoever's the biggest victim is the one who's got the most social currency. Beneath them, the influencers and the people that get all the likes and tweets and retweets and stuff on social media are the people that got all the money. But whoever's got the best character or the best ability to serve the needs of others is usually at the bottom. Because who cares if you're not a victim? And the way that you move up is you have the most intersectional victim hierarchical structures you possibly can. A biblical value hierarchy would probably be something like this, putting faith, hope, and love at the top, meeting others' needs in the middle, and then all the power, influence, and prestige, money in the world at the bottom as the least of all traits. And then between kind of this one and this one, what we see is Jesus kind of flipping the expectation, flipping the world upside down by flipping the value structure upside down. The question you need to ask yourself is, what is your value hierarchy? What are your top values that you discern as being more important than other things? Because by meeting them, you're actually going to find you like yourself better. And if you don't like yourself, you're probably not living up to your own values. And so you're not being chemically rewarded. You have no peace with God because you're not spending any time with God, but you know that you should. And this is where, we get into like guilt trips and stuff and throw ourselves pity parties. That's all a waste of time. If you just accept the responsibility that you know you should be living up to, you will actually naturally move up the value structure, gain social currency, and be able to actually gain influence in culture and help the society around you actually grow and develop. So in the end, discrimination is this. It is filtering out most things so that you can concentrate on some things. But what I'm getting at is I want you to think of this in terms of the Bible. When it comes to God and His book, what do you expect to see? Because what the selective attention thing is that video and that exercise is telling us is that most of the time what our brains filter out and see is what we expect to see. When you expect to count the basketball running here, you can miss a gorilla walking across the whole thing. If you're focusing on one thing, you're just naturally letting other things go. That's to be expected. That's part of the process. But when it comes to reading the Bible, what we expect to see may not be what the author is trying to say. It may not be what God is trying to say. So you need to take stock of this. What do you expect to see? What do you want to see? Do you come to the Bible and you expect X, Y, and Z to happen? Do you expect God to tell you that you're great, wonderful, grand, glorious? Or do you expect God to tell you that you're a no-good sinner and there's no hope for you? Neither one of those are particularly accurate biblical things. If they're based on some truth, they twist that truth. So what do you expect to see? What do you want to see? What do you need to see? Because oftentimes, we don't ask God to show us what we need to know, and we don't go looking for that. We ask God, however subconsciously, God, this is what I want to see. I expect you to show it to me. And we put that fundamental idea on God, and then we wonder why we don't know Him better. Because we come to Him and we expect Him to somehow operate around us. So probably out of all three of these, the most important one is, what do you need to see? If God told you a story, would you be willing to listen to the story? And if God wrote His story down, would you be willing to read some of it? Say the first 11 chapters of Genesis. But even if you read the story, the question becomes, can you understand the story? Because that's not, anybody can read it. And of course, things are always going to get lost in translation. So it's going to be really hard to understand the story just by reading it with your expectations. So asking yourself, what do I expect to see out of this? One of the best things that you can recognize in Genesis 1 is that the ancients didn't care where the physical material came from. And as far as the story is concerned, the physical material is already there when God starts forming the creation. He's not creating physical material in Genesis 1. He's taking a blob of worthless physical existence and turning it into, discriminating it from all of its different elements and creating a place where life can live and thrive. If you expect the text to tell you where the physical universe started or how the physical universe started, you're out of luck. It's not trying to ask those and answer those questions. It just ignores it. We'll talk more about that as we get into the text, but this is all just priming us here. And so as I continue to prime, let's spend a few minutes here just talking about principles for reading the Bible. This is not an exhaustive list. I don't know that there is an exhaustive list, but I've got 8 or 9 of these here. Some of these I covered in Wednesday Conversations today because, of course, they ask questions about Revelation, which is the simplest of all interpretive books of the Bible. So I certainly didn't have to mention any of these, but okay. Number 1, don't read the Bible literally. Read the Bible literarily. What do I mean by that? I mean that only after you've taken in and answered questions of genre and literature, the literary nature of the text, only then can you begin to actually understand the story of the Bible as the author intended it to be understood. Literally or not, historical books like Kings and Chronicles are pretty straightforward, but the genre is history. Very different from a prophetic book that's looking at history and extrapolating out of it and the law what God is going to do, and then expressing what God is going to do in very non-literal terms. Many stories are just not meant to be read literally. And you come to know this by defining and understanding the genre the writer is actually using. I've already been over the fact that Jonah is not a historical story because there's no history in it. The author is actively taking available historical data out. So he's telling you through the negation of history, don't read this book historically, and most people have read it historically because they don't understand what other options are possible. Satire. Okay, so misapplication of the genre leads to misreading and the misapplication of the text. And at best, you come to good applications of the text by actually misreading the text. It does happen. So what you want to do is you want to work to discover the author's themes and motifs throughout the text as we have it. But the starting point is to realize, what is this genre? How is epistles different than a gospel? And it's going to tell you how you're to read this and what literary devices and cues you're going to have to pay attention to. How concretely is Paul speaking when he says, I don't know, I just had a brain fart. Uh, you know, I don't know. We're going to move on. Number two. All right. Number two, read the Bible like you read fiction. Note, I did not say that the Bible is fiction or is fictional. What I mean is that when you open a book and you know the genre is fiction, you have certain expectations of that book. You assume that the author is including or excluding anything that he or she puts in that book, so that when he gets to his climax, when she comes to her thematic conclusion, you've bought into it. You accept the conclusion because you've been led along by the author from beginning to end, accepting characters, plot, pacing, all these things, so that you come to the end and you buy the ending, the conclusion that the author actually wants. See, that's what you need to actually do with the Bible. You need to sit down and assume that the author is including things and excluding things to lead you on a journey, so that when you come to the end of the journey, you arrive where the author wants you to arrive in. The same way that you do every fictional book. It's different than a textbook, because you think a textbook is just trying to download information to you as much as possible, right? Think more in terms of narrative and storytelling, especially because so much of the Bible, whether it's strictly narrative or poetry, is trying to tell you a story and encompass its ideas narratively. So even if you know this is a historical story, they're still wrapping it up from beginning to end with certain ways so that you can come to certain themes, conclusions, and theological understandings. If you can accept that idea and read the Bible like you would read fiction, you'll be far better off. You'll look for the themes and the motifs that the author is picking up on based on what he's constantly repeating and harping on. And then, just as an aside, biblical theology is the building blocks of systematic theology. What do I mean by this? When I refer to biblical theology, I'm referring to studying books of the Bible as books. So, biblical theology, all of Paul's literature is called Pauline theology. Paul has a very different theology than Matthew. Matthew is very different than Luke, but Luke, who traveled with Paul, has closer theology to Paul, but not exactly. So you could look at Lucan theology, you could look at Johannine text, Isaiah, prophetical text are grouped together, but 12 minor prophets are very 12 different people, and they write differently. There's similarities because they're using similar genres, except for Jonah. But out of that, what you do is, as you learn to study books of the Bible, you learn to actually pick together their themes and motifs, which ones are talking about the same things and can be grouped together or discriminated together, discerned together, and which ones may be using the same terms but wildly differently and should not be grouped together. The danger of systematic theology, the way that I was originally taught it 15 years ago, is, hey, here's everything the Bible says on the Holy Spirit. And then you just try and put all these verses together and you try and systematize these verses. The trouble is, you're ripping those verses out of the context the way the author is using it in his epistles or books. So you really need to study book by book by book for the long term, and then start seeing how those books are built, overlapping, and building their individual theologies, and how those books are grouped together to build biblical theology in a bigger sense. That's really, really the best advice that I can give you. Work on biblical theology, and over time, you'll build your systematic theology. Don't jump to systematic theology. Number 3, this should be obvious from tonight. What you look at determines what you see the clearest. So the reason I talked about the canon last week and what books we exclude from the canon is because whatever books your church or tradition puts in the canon is going to take up the bulk of your vision. But whatever history you focus on is going to determine how you're going to interpret those texts. It affects how you look at the text. Example, if you're reading Luther and Calvin and you're accepting that whatever they're saying is going to be true automatically, that's really no different from a Protestant perspective than accepting what Irenaeus or Augustine or Aquinas or even Plato said that the Catholic Church develops. Because you're putting this lens, right now I have contacts on. You got your glasses. Everybody here has got lenses on of some kind. You don't see those lenses. You see through those lenses. This is what this rule is trying to say. But the way our brains work is, whatever you focus on, your eyes make that clearer, and then everything around your peripherals gets fuzzier. So if I ask you to focus on something, and while you're focusing on that, I said, now look over there and tell me what you see. He was like, I don't know, it's all just fuzzy on the side. And that's how our brains work. Well, if you're going to read the Protestant Reformation into the Bible, you're going to come into as much trouble ultimately as the Catholics who they protested against, because none of these groups are the context of the biblical text. So you have to acknowledge your worldview. You have to check your worldview, and you have to say, okay, I'm a 21st century American. I was taught science and the Big Bang. Nobody before the 1600s understood what science was. It wasn't a thing. So for 1600 years, the biblical text existed, and they didn't have science as a category. So can't use that to read these literary texts. So what categories can I use? What did they have available to you? Stuff like that. And my suggestion to you is, if you're going to really learn the biblical text, you really need to learn to read the text that the authors had available. Read Second Temple literature, and you will understand what Jesus is raging against with his opponents of the scribes and Pharisees, because of how they twisted the Old Testament to mean certain things based on the lenses that they wore. And he's trying to rip those lenses off, and then successive generations put these other lenses on, and it just makes the text fuzzier, but you think that you're seeing clearer. And I really want to rip the text, see the scales fall from everyone's eyes so that we can all read the text better. But it depends on what you're looking at that determines what you think clarity actually means. Then, just as an added aspect of this, the stories that we do and do not tell affect what we see and emphasize. And what I mean by this is, like, whatever biblical books that you read or don't read is going to affect how you interpret the other books. If you continue to skip Leviticus because you find it boring, you're not going to understand what holiness is when Jesus is coming along and discussing holiness. What is Numbers is a great tragic book. If you get used to reading tragedy, it's a wonderful book. I'll give you an example of this from history. Catholics read everything through the lens of Peter. Protestants, we read everything through the lens of Paul, specifically Galatians and Romans, because we read through Luther's eyes. That's what he taught us to do. And most of us do it without question. And then we can compare the legitimacy of James saying that faith and works are necessary based on how we start, because we started with Paul. Paul said faith, but he didn't actually ever say faith alone. Luther added alone into that word in Galatians. Maybe Paul and James aren't actually in contrast with each other at all. But our starting point can be whatever. But eventually you're going to have to move around and look at different things in order to see different things. And my point in including this is just the fact that because we skip whole portions of the Bible and we don't take seriously that text as the Word of God, we skew our own vision long term. If you want to solve your vision problems long term, you're going to have to move around and look at different books, and ones that you may have been skipping for years that the New Testament authors did not skip. One last example here. The apostles emphasized Jesus, not his crucifixion. They emphasized his resurrection status as Messiah. The Protestants, we overemphasize the atonement of the crucifixion because we rip verses out of context in 1 Corinthians that says, yes, I resolve to know nothing amongst you but Christ, and yeah, him crucified, as meaning, okay, all we need to do is figure out how the crucifixion works and figure out our atonement theory, and nobody ever pays any attention to the resurrection, except, Easter's coming up, so I guess we'll give it lip service then, and then we have no ascension theology, no exaltation theology whatsoever. And my question is, do you actually know the story of Jesus beyond the cross? Could you give a gospel presentation to somebody that actually leads up to Jesus is sitting on the throne right now at the right hand of the Father? Because the New Testament authors, that's the first thing that they do in Acts chapter 2. As soon as the Spirit falls and they're out there proclaiming Christ, this is actually what they're emphasizing and proclaiming, that he is the risen king. And out of that, they have to explain the crucifixion's purpose. Okay, a couple more here. I'm running out of time. I want to give you time to question. Number 4, understanding biblical text requires swimming in the same rivers of thought the writers themselves swam in. There was once a man who walked up to the water, and on the edge of the water of the lake, there was a fish swimming just below the surface. And the man asked the fish, "How's the water feel?" And the fish responded, "What water?" Because the fish doesn't understand that he's swimming in water. And if you ask certain questions of the biblical writers, they would look at you like you're crazy for even asking the question. They're swimming in certain ideas that we don't know, and we need to rediscover them in order to at least mentally swim in those same waters. To understand a biblical creation story, you're going to have to understand ancient Near Eastern cosmology. So we'll have to spend some time talking about what cosmology is and what the ancient Hebrews' cosmology was. It requires research and thinking outside of modern American systems of thought. And it excludes scientific thinking, as I've already mentioned. Instead, you should try reading the Baal cycle. You should try reading the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story. That will actually help you understand Genesis 1 and 2. So I will have those stories up here as we go through those stories, and you will see the similarities and the differences. Number 5, don't follow the symbol. Follow what's being symbolized. When we fail to understand the literary symbols, the metaphors, or whatever is happening, we will default to an overly literal interpretation. The symbols likely have a literal corresponding point in reality, but you'll likely misread what that point actually is if you misunderstand the metaphorical logic being employed by the author. So instead of forcing overly literal interpretations, you should really try to understand the metaphor. And then instead of following the metaphor and saying, aha, he's metaphorically describing a car or something. Well, maybe the car itself is the metaphor for movement and travel, and it has nothing to do with a literal car, something like that. I don't have time to go through these examples, so let me just stick with this one. 3 days, for instance, is a Hebraic idiom for a short span of time. So if you know what an idiom is and you pick up on the 3 days, they didn't have standardized time. They didn't have watches on their hands or anything. So, but I mentioned that one because I've heard people, as we get into Easter, who will say, "I think Jesus may have been crucified on Wednesday because he was in the earth for 3 days, and then that doesn't mean 72 hours because they didn't have exact time. It just meant a short span of time, and a short span of time is like more than a day, less than a week in the ancient world, and that's where you get the idiom 3 days. All right, be careful about asking the question, what does this have to do with me? Because the answer might be nothing, but it's the Word of God, so show some respect. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't ask the question, I will suggest that you probably shouldn't ask the question first. It should be one of the last questions you ask, but that you should ask the question eventually. I would just move it down in the value system and the value structure to be a much later question. Don't make it your first and foremost question. Because just because something doesn't seem important to you and you don't know how or why it's applicable to you does not mean that you have God's permission to ignore it. Just because we don't have a temple or a tabernacle does not mean you should not understand the sacrificial system. It would be really beneficial if we did, even if we didn't plan on setting up a tabernacle. Instead, take time to understand a biblical author, even if it seems irrelevant to yourself. Maybe God will reveal that relevance to you later, maybe even years down the line. Maybe God intends you to learn this so that you can help somebody else who's struggling with a particular issue, even if it's not your issue. But see, you can't serve somebody that way if you're stuck in this mindset of, well, what does this have to do with me? Nothing? Great. I'll just discern that out. I'll just discriminate that out. Because if it's still the Word of God, you keep it in, even if it has nothing directly to do with you. Because it's just better to know it and not need it than to need it and not know it. And then the last thing I'll say about this is we're going to move slower in these first few chapters because we need to build the right foundation. But if we can lay the right foundation and we build off that foundation, we're going to be able to move much, much, much faster. So there's likely to be things in the Genesis prologue that will seem very irrelevant to you. But when you get to later stages in the Bible, they're living in light of what the prologue is actually saying, and they're assuming what the prologue is actually saying, particularly Babel and everything that goes on there. Okay, I'm just going to read you these last last three things, and then I'm going to let you ask questions if you need to. So, in the absence of answers, don't make them up to appease yourself. The human brain doesn't like a vacuum, so it tends to, if it doesn't get certain information, it tends to use the imagination and fill in that information itself. That's not good. You shouldn't do that. You have to be able to check your brain in these respects. 8, learn to ask good questions and learn to find good answers. That's all you can do. There is not an original question that you can ask of the Bible that somebody out there has not already asked and answered. Somebody has asked those questions before. Somebody has attempted to answer them before. So go out, figure out the who, what, when, where, why, and my advice, learn to read good scholars. Not pastors. Pastors are kind of dumb. And I mean that because in a teaching sense, they divorced pastoring and shepherding from teaching. And that's not good. So scholars are out there doing the heavy lifting of learning. And scholars are really just the best men and women who have found the proper answers to the right questions. But you need to learn to do this because in the end, discipleship is just learning to ask intentional questions and get the right answers to them so that you can go about living the right way in light of those right answers. Finally, I will say this. When I was 13 and I became a Christian, I came up with 4 things that I wish somebody had told me then that I will tell you now in case nobody has ever told you. As a Christian, it is okay to be scared, it is okay to be confused, and it is okay to be hurt. Now, if you're scared of the big bad Bible because it's 31,102 verses and you don't know where to start, that is okay. It is okay to be confused as you go through text and chugging along in text that you may find completely boring. It is okay to be confronted with something in the text that really hurts your feelings. I don't think God is going to change the text to appease your feelings, but it's okay to feel hurt. Jeremiah did, which is probably why he wrote the biggest book. But number 4, despite all of these or any other things that you feel, you still have to try. You still have to fail. You still have to get up and continue learning and trying again. So don't let that scare you. Embrace that as the process. This is why I use this picture for this. You see all of these dots in here? They're all individual dots, but your mind just naturally discriminates, groups them together, and then weaves a whole picture in so that you see a Jackson Pollock or whatever is like that, a bunch of dots and stuff.